Last week, I took you guys through the basics of the stolen generation era, what it was, what the policy was, and the continuous impacts. If you haven't watched it yet, be sure to go back and watch it after this episode. This week, I'm going to take you through the national apology that was made by the former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and the impact that it had on the Indigenous community. In this episode, we sit down with the man himself as he takes us back through that historic day. Be sure to stick around, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel.
Today we honour the Indigenous peoples of this land, the oldest continuing cultures in human history. We reflect on their past mistreatment. We reflect in particular on the mistreatment of those who were stolen generations, this blemished chapter in our national history.
On February 13, 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd made a formal apology to Australia's First Nations people, particularly the stolen generation whose lives had been shattered by past government policies of forced child removal and Indigenous assimilation. Indigenous Australians flocked to Parliament House to hear the speech in person. The press gallery was packed with members of the First Nations community who couldn't help but let their emotions out as the government finally apologised. So can you just take us back through the National Apology Day and what was going through your head as you're walking through the chambers?
Well, I remember walking into the House of Representatives that morning. In fact, I was walking in with Anthony Albanese because Albo was then leader of the House. And I had literally finished writing the speech 10 minutes before. And Albo was a little frustrated with my tardiness in bringing the text to conclusion. As I walked in, I saw gathered in the galleries this sea of Indigenous faces from right across Australia. Of course, Therese and I had been greeting them as they came into the building that morning. But it was overwhelming to see the faces of Indigenous Australia waiting patiently in the gallery for something which should have happened a couple of hundred years before.
In 1997, WA was the first government to issue an apology, and by 2001, all state and territories had issued theirs, all except for the federal government.
I do not believe as an issue of principle that one generation can assume responsibility for the acts and deeds of an earlier generation. I don't accept that as a matter of principle.
But in the eyes of many, an apology could help heal the nation and allow us to move together as one. One person who supported the apology was Kevin Rudd. In 2007, the Labor Party under Rudd won the federal election and took office. It supported making a formal apology to the victims of forced child removal.
There were some nervous Nellies within the Labor Party at the time who thought this was the wrong signal to deliver to the Australian people so soon after having been elected as Prime Minister. I had exactly the reverse view. This should be the first order of business for the Parliament of the new government. And unless we use the full momentum of having just been elected in order to achieve this, and then it would begin to unravel.
And it was witnessed by thousands of people who gathered in Canberra for the event and was broadcast live across the country. But not everyone agreed with how the apology was handled. Jim Morrison, the CEO of WA's Stolen Generations Aboriginal Corporation, stated that he believed the government should have done more to educate Australians about what happened to stolen generation members and how horrific the act was.
So for me, whilst it was perceived as an historical event, it was hollow and meaningless to so many of the people that I represent. It has to be, from my point of view and from the people that we work with, is that cultural, renovation or getting back to understand how lucky we were in our culture and how culture is strong, and broader Australia to say, well, why can't we be proud of First Nation people? Why can't we be proud of the oldest living culture on the planet? So I think there is that resilience has to capture cultural revival, and cultural revival is healing.
People won't always agree on a way forward, but the apology was a big moment in our country's history. The apology might not have brought back the years of trauma or the pain of not knowing where you came from, but it allowed for a glimmer of hope that we as a nation could finally come together and move forward united.
For the pain, suffering and hurt of these stolen generations, their descendants and for their families left behind, we say sorry.
Mr Rudd has some serious advice for both major parties ahead of this year's election.
As soon as you fail to deliver on your word, the unravelling of trust then is a fairly rapid process.
As a party leader who made big promises to the country's First Nations peoples, Mr Rudd said that politicians need to remember that the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can't be toyed with.
For me, the miracle of the apology was not that I delivered it. The miracle of the apology was that Indigenous people accepted it, because that, I think, created a bridge through which we could then engage in the much harder questions of closing the gap and the ongoing process of reconciliation, for which the Uluru Statement is, of course, the remaining area of unfinished business.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel.